Well, hello everyone. My name is Nate Smith. A little bit of a disclaimer here before we start. I am a shareholder in American Eagle, and this presentation, of course, will have some forward-looking statements in it, as well as there's a lot of gross oversimplification and some approximation on account of I don't actually have access to the data other than what's been made available publicly. So with that in the rear view, I'd like to talk a little bit today about 2022 and 2023 drilling seasons for American Eagle and a bit of a review of those. And then I would like to summarize and say right off the bat here, the biggest takeaways I'm hoping you can get from this is understanding that the drilling to date has largely missed the what we're calling the IP signature target, or what the IP signature has revealed as being a potential target. That the high-grade surface deposit drilling in the south zone is going to end up being what holds the key to unlocking the entire project, is my opinion of the matter. The north zone at depths is exhibiting evidence that it might be near the higher heat zone of the Porphyry intrusive due to some of the results, and we'll get to that. And that the potential scale for NAC is significant, given what we've seen to date from it and what it could potentially deliver here in the future, which I'll provide some examples for here down at the bottom. So right off the bat, a little bit of a level set, an approximation of like what the NAC project is drilling. So it's a typical Porphyry model arrangement whereby you have a primary intrusive as well as the follow-up dikes, both early and late. Very interesting to note about the dikes that we have seen intruded on top of the main Porphyry system is that they're showing a level of mineralization that is not very typical. Typically, you see barren dikes come in afterwards. In this case, we have dikes that are actually bearing a significant amount of mineralization. So if you are not familiar with Porphyry systems, and the way to imagine them is to consider a sleeve of a cylinder around the actual main intrusive itself, where the higher grades zone lie. And so I've used the example of a beer bottle cut in half. And in this case, the system is slightly tilted, and expressed at surface, you've had the top part of it eroded is what it looks like has happened. So what that results in is having what is typically the deeper set, higher graded parts of the system actually near surface, and that it's more accessible for drilling on account of the typically the barren or either gold bearing argillic overtop print has been eroded away. So you have clear access to the potassic zone. That being said, there's still a phyllic halo around this, which is accounting for what is expected to be the pyrite halo that they've drilled into, as well as interesting pyrrhotite on the outside. And then, of course, with the potassic alteration that has been visible to date, and we'll get into that. But I've used the example of grab a water bottle, hold it up by the escape key, and kind of look down it. That's what we see when you're looking at this thing north to south, is an approximation of the tilt. So I've put in this slide deck here, and I highly recommend taking a chance to view it if you get a chance. Is Stephen Garwin's presentation. He does a really great job of talking about where you see metallization. And one of the reasons and things I touched on was with regards to potentially encountering the higher grade and higher temperature zone in the north, on account of we're seeing encountering of magnetite associated with not only bornite, but also chalcocite, which typically only forms around some of the hotter areas of a porphyry center. And so there's this evidence here to date that we might have some higher grade zones potentially encounter in that north zone. And also the deposition of in the south zone, seeing a molybdenite and gold association a little bit higher than the copper is also lends to that argument. And so, yeah, highly recommend checking out this video. Very informative. Stephen Garvin's done some great work in that space. And you might see the analogous arrangement there here at the NAC project. So take some time to watch that if you get a chance. So comments on the prior to 2022 drilling. So the AE team is not the first to advance this project. Of course, there was drilling all through, I believe, the 70s through the 90s on this project, where approximately north of 20,000 meters were put in. However, most of those were shallow and a bit sporadic all over the property until they started to hone in a little bit area in the southwest and the north zones that we've started at or seen expanded on with the AE team. Some changes to the assumptions that were underset in the past with regards to the majority of the copper gold mineralization being hosted in andesite. What we're seeing now in the southwest zone is this conglomeratic unit actually being now responsible for hosting some of the significant mineralization that we've seen to date. So there's a bit of a change since we've now seen drilling below that 200-meter depth. And that's important. I mean, that was the original reason of why the team came to AE at the time. came to the NAC project was with this thesis of going deep to see what fed the system. And in 2021, that's when they picked this project up and pivoted into it. 2022 was the discovery of, hey, there was mineralization to depth, as well as there's some preliminary deeper geology understanding, especially with holes 4 and 7. And that's what actually put this project firmly on my radar, on account of we saw a higher grade at mid-depth, I'll call it, that in between the 300 meter and beyond the 200 that had been typically drilled off with the previous operators, as well as some interesting mineralization, the chalcocite and hypogene, below in the depths is what really got my attention, on account of you do not typically see that mineralization assemblage in BC projects as it is, unless you're in, I'm holding my hands up here, unless you're in the supergene blanket of a porphyry system. You typically see chalcocite encountered there due to the secondary enrichment. To see it at a depth in hypogene is very unusual for a project, especially here in BC. I can't think of many analogous to it. So that was very interesting and got my attention. So 2023 then actually delivered validation that they had something, on account of the step outs to the southwest zone, drilling westerly into areas that had never been drilled before, had yielded additional mineralization. And it wasn't until the end of the 2023 season when the updated IP lines were available. This is building on the original geology from the prior to 2022 drilling, as well as the geophysics run, over 30 years old geophysics. These updated IP lines lended the an interesting target interface at the chargeability and resistivity interface. We'll call it the shoulder. In this target area is where then hole 17 was lined up and collared. It was the only hole to benefit from that targeting data at the time, that yielded the headline number, the Chile grades in BC arrangement, right? The 600 meters of 0.74, I think, and then that higher grade interval of over 1% over 300 meters. So of course that got everybody's attention, and is now the actual focus of what I'm looking at reviewing here in this presentation today. But what I want to bring to attention is not only is that signature yielded for 17, but I stipulate that target signature has now retroactively validated that thesis of this signature bearing the high grade zone for the other holes. So we'll look to get into that. So for 2024, I expect them, of course, to expand on the southwest to northwest. We're going to look to connect those areas, is what my expectation is. I expect that if at any point they end up countering a high potential for the feeder, i.e. one of these higher grade dikes that have been associated with bringing in a lot of the grade, if they can chase that, I think that would be a potential to see on the table, as well as the preliminary work to start connecting what's called the southwest zone over to the southeast, on account of they drilled one hole in 2023. It's approximately a 750 meter step out to the east. That hole yielded, moderate grade, lower grade. However, it was a wildcat hole drilled in an area never even touched on before. I think if we have a successful 2024 year, 2025 will continue on building that out, but also what we're going to call the full donut, i.e. being able to drill around the entirety of the porphyry stock. I think it behooves us, if we see the mineralization tenor that we are getting with the signature IP study, that target being able to yield, I think is also prudent to see some of that targeting in the southeast to northeast, as well as the northwest to the northeast, connecting it all the way around. And we'll see what happens in 2026. It's getting a little hand wavy out there, but I think that's kind of the bigger stepping stones that we'll see here in the next couple seasons. A little bit of a presentation format overview. So this is just a generalization. You're going to see this format over and over through this presentation. The top left is your drill hole. In the red, I've highlighted higher grade intervals, as well as breaking it down just from copper equivalent into the individual constituents. In blue will be the overall interval. And then in pink, I've highlighted what this is my own interpretation of this, and remember, full disclaimer, it may be incorrect, but in the pink area is where I expect you'll see, and I'll see the interface with either being intersecting the signature or crossing very close to it. And then in blue, I've also put this into a couple slides just to highlight and bring to your attention some of the intercepts that have terminated in porphyry. Okay, there's some significant intercepts that have both a bearing grade and as well as not bearing grade. And I think it's important that we highlight that to identify where and how some of the system appears to bear more grade. And that's, of course, in that northwest zone to date. Okay. So then we have the copper equivalent and then the lithology definition. Okay, keep in mind the sandstone, sorry, not sandstone, but the volcaniclastic conglomeratic unit is what we're finding is, I've been calling it a mineralization sponge, as well as the grandiorite in pink, that is your porphyry, the Babine stock that intruded. That's this big unit here in the middle. Okay. In plan, you'll see from looking top down, the area section. In blue will be the collar of each hole that we're going to be discussing. And then over here on the right, I've done an approximate, we'll call it a thumb suck. It's a gross oversimplification of the actual, pardon me, the target signature area highlighted here with the blue circles. In purple is proposed, we'll say, shallower drilling that would be aiming to target at an area that I've been calling the shelf. If this is the shoulder, this is the complementary, in anticipation that if we do see some mineralization here, it'll be in that less than 250 meters depth, but below, we'll say 150 meters. So 150 meter down to 300 meters is very prospective in that if they can demonstrate holes that are in this area are yielding high grade, it would be that near surface higher grade volume that we would like to see here, stepping out in this case to the west of a lot of the drilling that we've seen to date. So that's very prospective, given this signature is also yielding to surface and daylighting. In yellow are holes that would then be aimed at the deeper shot, i.e. if 17, for example, crossed the shoulder here going A to A prime, the holes in yellow would be an approximation of deeper shooting holes, okay? You'll see in some slides overlays of green. Those are actually holes that have been drilled, and we can reference those in the other slides, as well as I've done an overlay of the actual drill hole itself. Again, remember, this is just an approximation as best as I can given the data that we have, but it is an attempt to be aligned with what has been presented, okay? And we'll go to point those out as we go. I've also provided in the top right any additional commentary I think it's good to reflect on, okay? So with that, we're gonna start ripping into the actual presentation itself here. This is the IP signature. Keep in mind, they didn't have this available. There was only 3 lines run. I'll actually go back up a slide. There was 3 lines. My understanding is southwest to northeast that were run in the 2023. This data wasn't actually available until hole 17 was collared and drilled. So that was the first one to actually benefit from it. And lo and behold, it yielded some excellent results. Granted, it did have some things going for it to help it. It was a scissor across 8 and 11 that did encounter that shoulder as well. But it did a successful realization of both up dip and down dip of that mineralization, is that a word? Mineralization bearing area that we had on that shoulder, okay? So remember that this image that I created just based off of the one that was presented for hole 17, I will be using for all. It's an oversimplification on account of everywhere else in and around the porphyry is going to have a different response, and you'll see that here in the next slides, okay? So, pardon me, I actually made an animation that overlays both the historic drilling with the geology, but this is one of the only presentation slides that we have available to us that shows the existing collars. And as you can see, there's no, in blue here is the existing, and red is the 2022 to 2023. There's been no drilling out further to the west, which lends to that question mark of if it does daylight to surface in what I'm calling the IP shelf, we would expect drill holes over here to yield some additional results. I think it'd be a good one to challenge the AE technical team to present an overlay similar to like what I've done, or at least provide some more information on the collars that we have, where they have drilled, to see if those collars actually do in fact impact and touch on or intercept the IP signature that we now know is highly prospective. I don't think we have a lot of data available to us on that one. It'd be good to see, but they may have terminated too shallow, because if you recall, that looks like that IP signature, unless they're right on top of it for daylighting, would be approximately 150 meter to 300 meter depth. So I'm sure it would yield some data, but maybe not necessarily show the correlation there at this time. And then this is the chargeability section as well in plan, which goes to show the outside of this thing has a full signature donut. That is indicative that this system is not fault displaced. It's all post faulting. There is, my understanding, a major structural fault that goes from the southeast to trending northwest. That would be where you would see a typical control feature that would be allowing for the porphyry intrusive to work its way to surface from, or up to near surface, okay? So it's important to see these big structural faults. I unfortunately do not have a slide that demonstrates that, but if you go and you look those up yourself, you'll see that there's some very large faults that had existed prior to the mineralization coming in, okay? It's very important because a post mineralization means that the halo, if the mineralization of it is intact, you would expect it to be symmetrical all the way around. Whereas if it was pre, you would then have a displacement where some of the ore body might be shifted one way or the other, up or down. So it lends itself for that continuity in potential future, we'll say, exploration success. This is a tool from Google Maps. It's just an overview of the topography, as well as giving you a little bit of an elevation contour. So what's nice is that this entirety of what we have here is in this little valley, which lends to that question mark about whether or not it was eroded or not. Seems to be evidence of. You can see hole 9 is starting to do a little bit of a gain in elevation, which would be something down the road you'd want to consider with regards to mining. On account of you would see potentially an increase in strip ratio. But what we are seeing in hole 9 as it is so far, it is mineralized from surface, so it would actually still be of benefit. It's going to be a case of making sure that you can have your workings up to that elevation gain at that time. Other things to keep in mind down the road, where would you see sightings for a tailings facility? Where would you see sightings for your waste dumps? If you can haul any of it downhill or away, it lends itself nicely. So to see in the north and both the south, you have areas where it strips away and gradually loses elevation as well. So it could potentially lend itself nicely to be able to do for that dam construction or downhill waste haul, which would be nice for your fuel consumption, et cetera, for mining. Yeah, so getting into it, let's talk about the first things first, what I'm putting in quotes as the bookends. So in both the northwest and southwest zones, holes 5 and 15 were kind of the worst holes reported to date on this project, okay? And keep in mind, these holes, in my opinion, on any other site standalone would actually have been very indicative of a very prospective area. So as much as they're the worst, there's still actually grade in them. Specifically, you'll note that there's some higher grade veining, which is, of course, always begs the question of where did those veins come from? I don't by any means think that these have shut the door on the project, but I don't think they're going to be the focus of 2024. And in the southwest zone, especially with hole 15, you'll note the molybdenum actually picks up again, which is lends us to the metallization of deposition theory that we talked about a little bit earlier there with Stephen Garwin, with regards to like where you're seeing the edges of the porphyry system. And also, I'll make some comments specifically when we get into each hole. So here's the start of that format. You'll note I didn't overlay the IP section. We don't have that available to us in this area. We do for hole 9, and you'll see when we get there. But for over here, we don't know where they actually have. Question mark out to the AE team there to get back to me on this one. But I'm pretty sure that if we were to overlay it, this hole would be likely too far to the east or southeast to be in the actual signature IP zone. If you expect the symmetrical donut arrangement and that interface of that shoulder and shelf, I would believe, this is just my own take on this, given the grade is there, but it's not higher, is that it was actually just offset a bit. Okay, so that's hole 5, and that was in 2022. Note the molybdenum pickup in hole 15, as well as note that they had a higher grade section here. And I have my own stipulation that this was actually touching or nearby the proximity of the IP signature target, either it being just shallower of the actual shoulder itself. So this might be an indication of where it is at. But again, this is in the southwest zone, and I don't have confirmation of where that hit at this time. Okay, again, I don't think we're going to see much more drilling south of this, but we may see a little bit more to see if maybe we can chase this higher grade up to surface. We'll see. I don't know. But I don't think this is going to be the focus, given that the efforts communicated to date is to build this zone out and then look to connect it to the north, as well as talking about walking our way to the southeast. Okay, so this will be the focus of 2024, in my opinion. This is what I'm calling the southwest to northwest divide. We're going to likely see the team start in the southwest and start walking the way north, given some of the results that they had to date. And this is going to really bulk out the tonnage of that zone, right? We'll have these two blocks to say, oh wow, they're actually connected, and they have this prospectivity of both the shoulder at depths and as well as what we have here at the shallow to daylight area of that interface. So it's going to be really interesting to see where and how that mineralization shapes up at surface. It'd be great if it does. And then lend itself to the economics and reduction of the strip ratio. Because you can imagine if at any time you had to push any of this back, if it's mineralized, well, that's that much better, right? Especially if you're wanting to try to get into these mid depths. So this is kind of like smack dab in the middle. There wasn't many holes that crossed this area at all. I mean, hole 3 was dropped as a vertical hole, and hole 2 crossed over it. As you can see, there was a little bit of grade pickup here, and I'll make some important notes about that when we get there. So hole 3, as you can see, I've overlaid it here. In my opinion, and as with a review of what's been presented from the technical webinar, which I highly recommend you guys grab and take for yourself, is that it was offset. It was too close and actually terminated in the Babine Porphyry stockwork, as you can see here, right? And I've highlighted that in blue on the left-hand side to bring that to your attention, because up here in the north is actually the only area where we start to see that grand diorite filled up with some of that veining and even some low background mineralization, which is very unusual because that Babine Porphyry stock has been typically very low grade. And to see grade as well as veining increase at depth is something I want to keep in your minds here as we go through. There's a couple higher grade sub-intervals that they've tried to highlight here, as well as the overall length. But by no means is this a headline hole, but it was definitely an early season indication that you can imagine if they started 1, 2, and then 3, something was shaping up, right? Yeah, so if I were to say I'd like to see another hole, I've tried to approximate 2. It's not doing a very good job because, of course, it was drilled with an azimuth from south to north. However, you could imagine that that's somewhat what it looked like it was crossing by. Of course, drilling here, I would love to see them, of course, step much west of it, shoot some holes towards the depth of that signature, as well as try to walk a few shallow holes out to the west to see if they can prove out the higher grade at that zone. Hole 16, this is now colored south, more towards where holes 8, 10, 17 were. As you can see, it terminated approximately just underneath where hole 17 did, except, of course, approximately over 100 meters or just shy of 100 meters north of it. So on this hole, again, you'll see that it was colored just a little bit too far east, in my opinion, on account of the grade only really started to pick up as it got past that 300 or into that past the 250 into that 300 meter depth. And then, of course, we then saw something also interesting show up at depth with regards to some of that higher grade. And it's of my opinion of the matter that it actually terminated likely near or into that high grade IP shoulder, okay? And you're going to see this over and over again, okay? Of course, again, I just use this as a template for almost all of these. We want to see the yellow going deeper, targeting it and trying to take it to depth, as well as the shallow along the way to the west. And then hole 10, same situation. Again, it looks like because it was further east, even more still than 16, that it only ended up terminating into what may have been near the actual signature itself. But again, at depth, you're noting there's this interesting grade pickup, right? And again, none of the IP studies were available until the very last hole of 2023. So we're going back and retroactively applying what we now know and looking at these holes to see what they yielded. At surface, though, is also very interesting, and it's not associated with this IP signature, is some of the higher grade area here in the southwest zone. Very shallow relative to the rest of the ore body, and higher grade pickup, which is very interesting. So this lends to this idea that we may in the future, say you're a mining company looking to approach us, you may use this area as your starter pit for a higher grade zone that would then propagate from here up into the northwest area, or even possibly to the southeast area. We don't know which way it's going to go. There just simply hasn't been enough drilling yet. But what we do know is that there's this very nice high grade pocket here in the southwest zone, and I didn't introduce that earlier, and I maybe should have put some more language to it, but that's what we're seeing here at the shallows. So rough approximation of like where those yellow holes and purple holes and the collars might be would be, if we'd be looking for, it would be slightly west of holes 3 and 16, and then of course further west still to see if we can see some of that shallow, what I'm calling the shelf target, shape up. So then talking to the southeast discovery. So this is hole 9. Kind of an interesting Hail Mary, in my opinion. What it did was it actually demonstrated, though, that this thing might have some scale. And this was, again, before we had the IP study, but we had some prospectivity of the area. But there's been no drilling into that zone, period, in even prior to 2022. So quite the step out and quite the wildcat hole. What we've seen here, though, is that it definitely has grade, and it comes up to surface. But like I said, the challenges of getting to that area due to the elevation gain is making it prohibitive to create a dedicated program right off the bat. So it was great to see. It demonstrated scale. It may not be the immediate focus in that area that hole 9 was collared for next year just because of access. But what I would say would be to expect some work from the southwest zone to work their way towards the southeast, maybe with some road building, or if the logging companies come in and create a clear-cut access area that they can then spur off of. We'll see. I do like the prospectivity of it. It lends to this idea that we have the full donut. It's just really tough to get in there and go after it right off the bat, but it lends itself as the immediacy of being able to say this thing might be actually much bigger than we thought. So interestingly, they do have the IP section there generated for us here from 2023. Note that it is south to north. And as you can see here, hole 9 was collared in that green area, which is actually not the actual signature itself that we're after, or that we have seen, I would say, the yield grade here to date. So there it is there, such that you can see. And of course, again, talking about the symmetricalness of this response this IP survey has revealed is very interesting, because of course we also have the other side of it further still in the north that is lending itself for some prospective targeting. So it was a great one to see that revealed in the technical webinar, and I think it lends itself as the opportunity maybe beyond 2024. The hole 9, if I were to approximate like where it was with regards to that signature, I think it was actually way away from it. That being said, you'll note that there is that background mineralization level that was encountered. And interestingly was this high grade zone right near surface where we had the gold stay a little bit higher and the molybdenum higher, which was very similar to like what we're seeing in the southwest zone, which leads to this prospectivity of it maybe being very similar and potentially connectable. So that's kind of exciting. But what I want to also bring to your attention is look at the porphyry, okay? So remember back in the day with hole 2, or not back in the day, but earlier in the presentation where I talked about hole 2, that there's almost no grade in this porphyry area here, right? And that again lends to this argument that I'm saying might be developed, which is the southwest zone is not necessarily near the heat source that drove the primary mineralization here of this intrusive. I think the northwest zone is where we're going to see, if anything, the higher grade porphyry engine, we'll call that, the heat engine of the system, actually arrive and be discovered. So keep that level of mineralization for the porphyry in the back of your mind when you're thinking southeast, and then consider what the ramifications are for in the northwest. But yeah, something I wanted to point out. Again, if we're going to do some drilling out here, I'd love to see the signature more readily targeted now that we know that it seems to be a bit more prospective, as well as if we can, as I mentioned, show that the mineralization comes up at surface because of that higher elevation arrangement, will definitely impact the economics of a future mining operation where you have to take into account the strip ratio. So something that would look approximate, this is just, again, just an oversimplification, but would be these yellow holes colored maybe slightly to the south of hole 9 in a line. As well as the shallower holes that are targeted. All right, so now we get into the northwest zone. I've put a lot of information here, but this is where this is the secondary target for the overall work that's been accomplished here to date. What's been interesting is we also reflect on is some of these higher grade zones that were encountered near surface in holes 12 and 4 and 7. That we, on retrospect, when we look at the IP signature, we see that it is actually highly correlated with the drilling in the north as well as with the south. I'm calling it validation accomplished. Of course, that's open to technical interpretation, but in my mind, it's like, okay, yeah, what we saw in the south validated is also being validated in the north. What I want to bring your attention to, and I've touched on a little bit already, is the unusually high grades encountered in the grandiorite, okay? We've seen not only high-grade veining, largely responsible from bornite, as well as chalcocite. And chalcocite is very unusual to encounter in hypogene, especially in BC porphyries in this region. I can't think of any in the couple that I've studied. I've looked at Morrison and then the 2 existing operations that have been mined out there, Bell and Grand Isle. Not seeing any noted occurrences of it, which is interesting, right? And this also lends to that potential of it being near the low sulfidation, high temperature core. Potentially, we'll see. So my thoughts is likely the system high grades feeder of this area is situated in that northwest to northeast zone, given that the results to date indicate those mineralizations. And hole 12 was actually the first hole that really got me very excited and was starting to validate some of the thesis. I know it didn't get as much attention on Twitter or the market's attention at the time, but I think upon retrospect, started to dive into this after seeing hole 17. We'll also note that hole 12, colored west and then drilled to the east of the azimuth, was actually a very eye-opener for what this system could potentially hold. So when we get to it, we'll talk on it a little bit more. I think this year we see them step out a little more to the west, to the north and the south. We're going to see them focus on that IP signature. And then hopefully, if we get lucky, see them take something deeper. That would be indicative that we're into a higher grade part of the system, and that would be very exciting. So here's the overlay from the webinar. This is me just taking a screen grab at the time. You'll note, you can see where holes 13 and approximately part of 14 that crossed into the actual signature. And you'll note the grade that picked up on that. Hole 4 and 12, which are just proximal to it, but are looking like they're anticipating a higher bump in mineralization. You'll see that. Hole 6 actually too is also in this image that we were able to to go. And note the grid scale is 200 by 200. And then, of course, I didn't actually touch on it the first time we looked at it too, but it's the symmetricalness of this, right? You have your intrusive center, and then you have these lobes on the edges, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that in slides here coming up. So hole 4 was the real reveal of, hey, maybe the north has something to go off of after hole 3. It was a straight vertical hole at the time, and it actually broke off. It was unfortunate because it likely would have yielded in 2022 the results that we were starting to see in 2023. That was not followed up on until with hole 12, which you'll see here in green. And you'll also note hole 6 was proximal. 13 and 14 were actually across it, and we'll see and take a look at where the grade hit there. But when we looked at the grade here, I want you to note the high grade at near surface. Now, the tonnage that's been shown here so far isn't enough to warrant a larger pit, but if we were seeing an open pit arrangement here, we could potentially see this mined a little bit earlier or later to offset maybe some lower grades as we're moving through here. It lends a little optionality with regards to your mining approach, with regards to sequencing. So it's nice to see some of this higher grade show up. It'd be nicer still if we saw some more tonnage show up. And we did see some additional with hole 12 collaring. However, it's by no means been drilled out as densely as in the southwest zone so far. Okay, and you will note that it did have that lower grade section there, which was actually in the historical holes in the past, below that 250 mark was the shutdown. So it was great to see the team push past that and reveal this higher grade section that really popped up. And you'll note that the copper grades was greatly increased. And this is also of note is the gold grades also increased, because this area in the north was seen as being gold poor. This was the first time we started to see gold at mid depth, we'll call it, start to pick back up again, which is very interesting on account of it being largely written off at that point. So it looks like this one was targeted and was actually gone right down in, or either into or near proximal to that IP signature. It's a shame that it was broken off, but I'm happy to say that we've been able to follow up on it. Hole 6 was colored, in my opinion, way too far off to the east, given what we now know. What's interesting, though, is after it popped out and started to work its way closer to the west, the grades did start to pick back up again. Especially note the copper grades started to work their way back up, as well as you'll note the gold grades started to work their way back up. Remember, this is a 2022 hole. They didn't have nearly the information that they have now. So that was a very unusual hole. You also note that the Babine stock, where it hit shallow, some grade, but not very much, typical to like what we saw over at hole 9. Right? But as you move further down, whenever we hit these veins, the veins did actually bring in and load up some of that mineralization. So it's note that the porphyry here is showing some level of grade due to that veining. And again, this lends to this idea that maybe the northwest zone is where we're going to see the higher, the heat engine of this system. Okay, hole 7 was the follow-up to hole 4. Note that it was colored off the same section of hole 4, but then it was targeted with an azimuth to the south. So this was back testing towards like what hole 3 was through. You'll note that, again, they hit the high grades at surface, gold barren. And in this case, the hole that then went further south, it ended up terminating in and around and near some of the mid-grade that we're starting to see that's associated with approximate near to that actual IP signature, okay? So I don't think that this actually hit the IP signature. If they did, it was largely in this area. However, it was, in my mind, still very proximal to it. It wasn't nearly as high grade as what we saw in 4, and later on what we saw in 12. Okay. Yeah, another interesting hole. It was, at the time, hole 4 and 7, upon review, were what I said was what got my interest on this project. On account of in this hole as well, there was reports of chalcocite being encountered, which is very unusual. Okay, going into 2023 now, you can see where they're looking to attempt to start doing this drilling to the east to the west, similar like what they were doing in the south zone with hole 8 and 11. And you'll note that there was that high grade section up at shallow. So it's nice. Well, I wouldn't say high grade, but elevated grade at shallow. And then as well as down below here, you definitely have that intercept of what it looks like is that signature system. So 100 meters of that was encountered and crossed over. And then, of course, the grade there started to drop off afterwards precipitously, which is interesting. So it's lending this idea that this whole area is likely more into that phylic, pyrite-rich, maybe in pyrrhotite-rich zone, where there's that interface, though, between the chargeability and resistivity is that high grades, IP signature target, which again, if we can see that drilled out with the purple holes when it daylights at surface, would be very nice from a mineralization economics wise on account of that's higher grade that comes all the way to surface. And of course, what we'll also know about 14 is that it was down dip to it a little bit more, and that interval actually increased, but the grade remained almost analogous to what we saw in 13. I'll just pop back up to 13. So you have that higher grade moly and copper showing up, and then in 14, the copper remaining higher and that moly remaining higher. So it's interesting to see that even as a step out even further, because that's over, I believe, just over 100 meters. So sorry, it's going to be over 200 meters from hole 13. That signature is continuing to see itself showing up at the north there. And again, this is where hole 5 from back in 2022, which we're considering a bookend, lends to this idea that it may have been just to the outside of that signature itself if it starts to follow along with that porphyry contour, right? So it lends to this idea that 5 was actually in the ballpark, but it wasn't actually playing the game. The hole 14, as you can imagine, I've shown it over and over again. Love to see it followed up at depths. However, these cross holes into the signature are very important as well because it shows that continuity and, of course, lends to that argument that I'm calling it the shelf might show up. And then hole 12, this is what got me hopping up and down excited, was on account of it was the first hole colored west shooting east, which was actually a big risk at the time, considering there's been no drilling out to the west. Hole 17, of course, came in the future. And what was really neat was that we saw high grade at surface, which was a significant step out from hole 4, as well as the run of what looks like they either hit into or just slightly approximately near to was the IP signature, right? So this is a direct follow-up to 2022's hole 4. And what we saw was that grade maintained all the way down, which was awesome, as well as the gold picked back up. And then what it terminated in was actually very important to reflect upon too, on account of, look, we're seeing the Babine porphyry stock hit, as well as in addition to having veining, the mineralization stayed elevated over that area. And this is where, if you guys, I encourage you to go take a look on their website, pull up hole 12's visuals, and you'll see the semi-massive chalcocite and bornite veining present. But it has also been reported on the way down too. There was chalcocite encountered in and around where hole 4 was, as well as further in between as well. And you can see it really started to bulk out that grade, which, if this was proximal to the IP signature, bodes even well for the fact that if one of these yellow holes end up being into it, they potentially could be even higher grade mineralization. And of course, this rock right here, the level of mineralization they had, I think the last couple of meters of it had something like 1.3% copper equivalent grade. I would love to see followed up on. What we do know is that as of May this year for the 2024 season, they're going to be running additional IP lines to get some more resolution because the IP studies, I mean, they're really, really high resolution down to that 300 meters. Anything below 300 meters starts to lose it, and below 500 meters, it really starts to drop off, right? So by having more long line IP studies executed on this project, we're going to have that much better the resolution for targeting, especially here at the depths of hole 12. But like I said, it starts to get a little hazy after 500 meters. So we're really going to be relying on some of the drilling to date, as well as any additional drilling that we see executed in this area. But again, this is what got me very excited about this project. Initially, it was hole 4. Hole 12 really sealed the deal for me on this one. But of course, that's my own bias speaking. But I encourage you to take a look at this and spend as much time or more than you do on hole 17 on hole 12 and some of the results here in the north. So that wraps up the northwest zone drilling and some of the view that I have on that. This would be somewhere where I would like to expect to see some of the collars to drill it further into that signature, as well as I would love to see some of this step outs to the west to really set up and get into some of the more shallow drilling. Okay, around the bend here on the southwest zone, sorry. Yeah, so on this one, this was where, of course, the hole 17, the chili grades in BC arrived from, which is awesome. Gold rich at surface, as well as molybdenum rich at depth, which is an unusual metal combo. If you've studied many porphyry systems, you don't necessarily see those guys associated in this manner, which may be indicative of secondary overprint or a very strong primary intrusive activity. So, I mean, in my books, both those bode well. We've talked a little bit about the initial goal of establishing a high-grade starter pit. I believe that will be the key to unlocking all of this project, as well as the meaningful step outs, which have added not only the grade, but the volume at both mid and lower depths. So that's really going to potentially set up this project to see what was going to be a smaller high-grade starter pit become a much larger pit. So 2024 is going to be about expanding the high-grade zones, as well as really bulking out that tonnage to see if we can get this into a larger pit. As well as we might see some walking out towards the north, west, and southwest to do, of course, that volume build in between, and going out to the southeast, as well as, of course, keeping an eye out for any source feeder to that zone on account of the prospectivity of it. Sorry, I'm going to have a quick drink of water here as we look at pardon me, the webinar cross-section. Okay, so in the cross-section here from the webinar, you can see where hole 11 actually crossed in and through that signature. Hole 17 was right into it. And of course, hole 8 crossing through it. Hole 1 over here off by itself. Interesting to note, a little bit of grade picked up at the bottom, as well as, of course, the shallow starter pit arrangement that we've been talking about. And then you can actually see hole 9 in this cross-section, which is kind of interesting, which gives you that other perspective of like where and how and what mineralization it hit. Of course, there it was showing that it was just in that intrusive, but there was a little grade pickup when it came near that signature, which is kind of interesting. And again, lends to this theory that this signature could potentially hold mineralization all the way around. But to be determined. Okay, hole 2 was an interesting hole in 2022, collared in the south, but at an azimuth and dip to try and stretch its way to the north. Of course, it showed that high-grade section right at surface. Apologies for the cutoff. I only had a couple cross sections available to me, which I kind of butchered to show for demonstration purposes. But you can see that we had that high grade at both the shallow and extended to depth and extended to the north, where they hadn't actually done any drilling there yet. So historical drilling there. So it really did a great job of bulking out some of the tonnage for that near surface high grade zone. And I also want to point out down at the bottom here, where what I think is another intercept into that porphyry system, especially, right, on account of we're seeing intrusive Babine-related stockwork identified, is look at that grade that showed up down at depth, right? And knowing what we know now, when you overlay that IP signature, it's like, oh, well, hang on. It looks like 2 is actually just starting to get into some of it. And again, note that it's that Babine grandiorite, which is very interesting to see have grade when given what we know about in the southeast zone. And at shallows, as you can see, very little grade other than what vein brought in, right? But then all of a sudden, boom, pick up higher veining, as well as some dissemination showing up in that Babine stock. So very, very prospective and lends to this argument that hole 2, 12, et cetera in the north could be potentially near that high grade zone. I've touched on that multiple times now. I don't know if you understand, but it's one of the big exciting factors for me here. If I were to say anything, I think the southwest zone is what unlocks everything, but the northwest zone is what's going to really shine here in the future and really bring this project's scale and potential to light to everybody. Hole 1, we touched on this one here from the cross section. Very high grades at surface. I mean, 1 gram per ton from right from surface, right? And then this interesting low grade all the way through, which knowing what we know now about where it was collared, we know, oh, it was likely collared too far east. Of interesting note, though, is down near the depth of it, it actually ended up having this high grade area where, this is intensely altered totolith, it was obscured, brought in some very high grades. My understanding is this is one of the high grade dikes the system, which we should touch on for a second. So diking, typically in BC projects, especially post-mineral diking, can often be barren and actually destroy some of your high-grade zone by coming in and really overprinting over top and displacing some of the mineralization that was in place prior to those dikes. What's interesting with the NAC project, though, is that they have these very unique higher-grade dikes that have come in afterwards and actually further enriched whatever was in place to begin with. And I think it's very unusual and of remark as a positive unexpected. So there's multiple positive unexpecteds that I've encountered on this project that make me remark and say, oh, wow, that actually really boosted and acted as a tailwind for this project. So these high-grade dikes, I refer to the visuals that have been provided. Great about posting. You take a look at these things. They're very unusual. And note how they actually act as a further enricher for some of the areas that they're encountered in. Case in point, hole 1, seeing that level of mineralization show up there. So then in 2023, the follow-up, hole 8 was that hole collared to the just southeast of hole 1. So this is actually a step out, and it was an aggressive one. I think it was over 50 meters. But then collared with an azimuth such that it was shooting to the west into a totally untested area. No drilling ever in that area. You may recall that I showed you even from the historical. So this is a bit of an interesting show, and it also was pleasantly surprised, right? We saw the shallow mineralization maintain, so it's like that high-grade starter pit argument continued to bulk out, but also is where we started to see this high-grade zone that we now know is associated with that IP signature get crossed. So again, similar like what we saw with hole 13 and 14 in the north, where it pierced that intersection, that intercept, we see that grade pickup, okay? And again, you start to see that grade fall off as we start to get out into the outer phyllic zone, where they actually reported seeing pyrrhotite as well. And so that's now seen as a bit of a shut-off rock on account of the grade has fallen off there. But again, this IP signature where it's pierced, yielding that result. And then seeing again now with hole 11, which was big follow-up to 8 and actually improved upon it at the time. That mineralization in in the shallows wasn't by any means muted, but it was definitely a little bit of a fall off from it, but not by any means outside of a cutoff. As well as where it hit higher up dip on that signature, we again see that grade pickup and end up being almost 200 meters of 0.9. So again, what we knew about 8 and 11 is what then set up the stage for hole 17 as they went forward with that as their last hole, when upon review of the IP signature, it was noted, hey, look, this shoulder that 8 and 11 crossed over would likely be highly prospective to see if it goes up dip and down dip of it. And this scissor then actually yielded the best results here to date on this project, with it going deeper and showing over 300 meters of that 1%. So of note, especially too, is the higher moly that was encountered and the gold grades that was also encountered at this milling depth. And you can see, in addition to some of this very high grade veining, what looks like it's been some of the dikes that have also come in to bring in grade, and it's all in that conglomeratic unit that has really soaked up that mineralization. Is a very good host for it. So a very exciting hole. Of course, this has brought a lot of attention to Chile and BC. And as you can see, it really did a great job of hitting the oblique to that signature shoulder, and lends itself to the validation of that shoulder being a valid target here going forward in the future. Now, with IP studies and geology and mineralization of porphyries, I don't know if it's prudent to expect that we'll see this level of tenor across the shoulder all the way along as we see that it exists. But it definitely lends to the attractiveness of it as a potential target, especially if we know that it's in similar geology, i.e. this conglomeratic unit. And I think it'll be a great tool now in the tool chest for the team to be able to proceed with really delivering a great year for 2024, knowing now what we have with regards to what the potential of these signatures can yield. Okay. So there's a quick overview of what I think maybe the Southwest zone will turn into, which is going to be some of that both a mixture of conservative and more aggressive step outs to target that signature more in depth, as well as maybe even start to see some of this initial work to start working our way out to that Southeast zone. Yeah, very exciting year for 2024 coming up, and I look forward to seeing those results. And so something else I wanted to touch on was the, kind of level set and say, well, for individuals who are not necessarily familiar with, porphyry projects, is to look at like maybe an analogous project in that, is there any other systems in BC that we have where we've seen a porphyry that's intact and largely is producing a very similar IP signature, or at least a resistivity chargeability signature? And sure enough, we do have actually a really good example in the Surge Berg project. Full disclosure, I don't have a position in Berg or the Surge teams project there. But I am using it here today just for some of this illustrative purposes. As you can see, they have an intrusive plug, similar to like what NAC has, and it's hosted in an andesitic unit, which we have a little bit indicated here in the north and in the southeast. But for the most part here, the drilling today has been in the Southwest zone, which is actually this conglomeratic unit. So there is some differences in the geology that is hosting this, but the intrusive plug is what I'm bringing to your attention here. It's a bit zoomed in on this representation from the technical report that's available for review. This one, of course, is 1,500 meters, whereas in that plug is about 1,000 meters. So other similarities, as you can see from the regional magnetics study that was done, you get a bit of this arrangement where it trends higher to the southeast and northeast and southwest, and then kind of fades off a little bit in the northwest. In similar, we have in NAC, we have a very high signature magnetic response, and then it kind of trends off a bit, which is indicative of some of the controlling features, that those larger underlying structural features, I would say, are evident. And then when looking at the IP line survey versus the ZTEM survey, to be able to look at some of that resistivity, and in this case, chargeability, is you end up with these lobes, right? And these high response lobes are where we have some of what was expected to be the phyllic zone, and as well as where you actually see in both these projects some of the mineralization show. Because what we do know is, except for the unusual higher grade pod here that has showed up, is that in the intrusive itself, we have a bit of a lower response for mineralization, but at the lobe edges, we see the higher grades of the system show up. In this case at Berg, a little bit lower grade and smaller intervals on account of just the way that the system has arranged itself. However, that mineralization, as you can see, all showing up right just proximal to the actual intrusive itself. In this case, this is the northeast section of Berg, and the lower grades in the intrusive in the center. NAC does have some unusualness to it, right? It has this higher grade areas, even though you'd expect them to be a bit lower, given that it's over top of the intrusive or just near to it. But what you do see in similarities is the higher grade zones showing up right around the edges of that lobe set. So I think that bodes well as like, hey, here's an analogous porphyry, in that it is a system that came in and mineralized the area around it. And in this case, for Berg, given it has such a higher level of drilling data available to it that they've drilled off, this is interesting. It's called a net smelter return. So this is looking at the valuation of the actual metal in the ground post mining in the the 43101. What it ultimately ended up yielding is over 1.5 billion tons in the measured, indicated, and inferred categories, right? And again, you can see that that mineralization showed up as an approximate donut around it, right? And that's again an isometric view of it as well, an oblique, which is kind of neat to see. And as you see, you get this lower grade kind of in between, and then this high grade area in and around those lobes. So if you're looking for like a how to imagine what maybe NAC could become, I mean, we're by no means there, and it's a bit hand wavy, but it also is, I would say, not out of the cards, right? So something to look forward to in the future. And yeah, I look forward to 2024 being an exciting year and see where it takes us. I've got one of these images I used for the building of it, and then of course there's that with it overlaid on the actual chargeability section that we have from the previous operators there from prior to 2022. So with that, I'll close out the presentation. I think that was about 40 minutes. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to follow up, please engage with me there on the Twitter. This is where I'll post this video for review, as well as I'll post a link to a download drop there so you can pick up this presentation for later review as well. So with that, I'll close that off. Thanks for your time. Look forward to your comments.